Good morning, everyone. I know that the room is still a little bit in flux, but since we have a really short time to cover a large, wide-ranging topic, and we do want to have some time for questions at the end, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Heather Staines, the head of partnerships at the MIT Knowledge Futures Group. We build open source software projects for publishers and libraries and researchers. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you guys about a new sense of campus privacy. I'm supposed to remind you to silence your cell phones and say there are plenty seats in the front, which at this point is still true and may not be true for longer, so please do come up. And we're going to hold questions until the end. We have a microphone here in front. The session's being recorded, and it will be much better if your questions come through the microphone for folks who are trying to watch later. So our speakers today will be kicking off with Darby Orcutt, who's here at my left. Darby is Assistant Head Collections and Research Strategy at NC State University Libraries and teachers in the Honors Program. He edited a collection a decade ago, Library Data, Empowering Practice and Persuasion. He's co-PI of a current National Science Foundation grant for undergraduate education and a national leader in developing library support for content mining and computational research. He's going to kick us off with a little bit of a background on campus privacy. Next up will be Doreen Bradley to Darby's left. Doreen is Director of Learning Programs and Initiatives at University of Michigan Library. She's responsible for leading information literacy initiatives, developing librarians as teachers, and assessing instruction. She's been involved in several library analytics projects, which she will talk to us about today, and recently in a 2018 IMLS National Leadership Grant, which again she'll tell you a little bit about. And then our closer will be Tim Lloyd. To the far left. Tim's been in the scholarly communications industry for more than 20 years. He spent the last 5 years focusing on identity access and analytics for library resources as CEO of LibLinks. And he's a member of the governance committee for the Coalition of Seamless Access and co-chair of the Outreach Committee, and he'll be talking to us about that there. So I'll hand over to Darby.
Thank you, Heather. We give up our personal information all the time, our users tell me. We get it, but we just don't think it's a big deal. Most of us in this room likely disagree, yet agree with them in our actions. We have smartphones loaded with apps that we've allowed to access our location, camera, microphone, and all kinds of data. Library users complain to me that they can't access their borrowing history. Accustomed to being able to easily find even items that they merely once browsed on Amazon, they find the library's website quaint and old-fashioned. When I presented on a data modeling project last year here at Charleston in this very room that would allow libraries to better assess the value of big deals, and in fact, a little plug just published this week in Charleston Voices, I was asked why certain elements of the model were just that, a model. Why not use actual patron data to get at some parts of the question directly? It's because academic libraries hide that information from ourselves. In respecting user privacy, we regularly sacrifice not only user experience, but also analytic and economic efficiencies. If librarians' hackles are rising right now, I'm not surprised. As a profession, we've been inculcated into a culture where user privacy is such an obvious good that in many libraries we do not or cannot question what it means or examine it with any nuance. Most of you can likely recall discussions of new services or creative solutions that have ended abruptly at the mere mention of privacy. Before Doreen and Tim each do a deeper dive into two vital areas where we need to be thinking harder about this issue, I want to take a moment to breeze quickly through some key checks to a knee-jerk perspective on privacy. First of all, privacy is fundamentally and historically central to librarianship. Sort of. Yes, a certain respect for privacy is enshrined in the ALA Code of Ethics from 1939 forward. But you'll note the privileging here of confidentiality, a related concept, but not quite the same thing. Privacy became the primary term only in 1981, and as you can imagine, our practices around user privacy have been ever-changing and evolving. It's easy to think that our current ideas are the same as they've always been, but this is far from the case. And ALA certainly hasn't helped with a historicized understanding of this, as sometime between 2014 and 2017, they apparently removed all prior drafts of the Code of Ethics from their website. Next, privacy may not be something we can even promise. Just to take library borrowing as the obvious example, this may be fundamentally out of our control. How many of us run our own servers that store this information and can guarantee against cyber intrusion? Perhaps we can promise confidentiality, but privacy? At best, we can perhaps merely communicate clearly to our users what are our practices, policies, and technologies. It is already the case that ISPs, phone companies, and vendors already know more about our users and even our individual users' search activities through either direct data gathering or triangulation based on information-seeking patterns. Next, technology may be outpacing our ability to protect information. A Russian photography student showed how easy it is to use images collected in public and use out-of-the-box facial recognition software to connect strangers on the metro with their online information. Artist Heather Dewey Hagboard collected hairs, chewed gum, and cigarette butts from city streets and used trace DNA to recreate the faces and even medical information of strangers. Note that both of these examples are 4 to 5 years old. Have we yet secured our wastebaskets? And what is next on the horizon? There are goods other than privacy. Forget the issue of balancing public safety and privacy for a moment, that long-debated hypothetical of users who are accessing library information on how to build bombs. Our student users face much more statistically common problems, and in fact, problems that might be larger and far more relevant to most of them than any issue arising from a lessening of library privacy. For one, nearly half of undergraduates are failing to graduate, let alone in 4 to 6 years. Along the way, they're piling up record amounts of debt that will weigh on many of them for most of their post-college lives. Campuses are trying to use better analytics to support students, not just academically, but with regard to students who may be at risk of depression and suicide. But libraries are often absent from these conversations, where our privacy practices diverge and are out of step with those of other campus units. Are we just a library, or are we a vital part of our college or university? Yes, privacy is essential to the functioning of a democracy, but so is an educated populace. Can we talk candidly about how to balance these two? Next, especially in today's networked culture, value increasingly derives from connection rather than silos. We certainly understand this when it comes to promoting open access, open data, and broader impacts for research outputs, but somehow fail to see the potential benefits when it comes to connecting personal data, except that as much as we may personally hate Facebook, Fitbit, Google, which are now the same thing, we personally appreciate their value propositions. Lastly, we have to consider that our own attitudes may reflect our own generational biases, and even more so, our profession's views of privacy may reflect a specific cultural perspective, one that is white, Western, socioeconomically privileged, and individualistically focused, one that may work against our efforts to be diverse and inclusive of cultures that may focus more on family, collaboration, and more it takes a village sorts of perspectives. Privacy is indeed extremely important in libraries, indeed too important for us not to have real conversations about it. Thank you.
So before I hand over to Doreen, I'd like to say there are seats scattered. If you have an empty seat next to you, maybe you could pop your hand up so some of the folks in the back can decide if they want to brave the rapids and jungles to come to the front, because we'd love to have you, move up and be closer. So please do feel free to move in. And next is Doreen.
Okay. Thank you. I am going to, this doesn't turn, take you on a very quick journey today with us on our path through dealing with engaged learning, learning analytics, data privacy, and it's kind of all intertwined. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about actually touches on what Darby talked about. We dealt with many of the same issues. So learning analytics, our campus really jumped in headfirst into learning analytics. Here is kind of a timeline. We had a learning analytics task force back to 2012, 2015. Out of that came a lot of campus discussions and speaker series around student learning and analytics. We did a lot of infrastructure work on our data warehouse, which we're fortunate in that most of our data on campus, our student data, it goes back to 1966, and we have it in kind of one data warehouse. I know many institutions have it siloed around campus, but we're fortunate that ours is together, so it was much easier to work with. Since then, we've been piloting a number of tools to really help students and touch on what Darby did, help them graduate more quickly and with less debt. eCoach is for students. It is a guidance and coaching software that can help students advise them based on their trajectory, where they are now. Are they better off next semester taking 2 courses simultaneously? Would they be better off sequentially? So just help them through that process of navigating. We're also piloting right now something called My Learning Analytics, which is a dashboard in Canvas for both faculty and students to help them understand kind of real time, where are they in the class and what do they need to work on, or are they doing great and just keep forging ahead. We also have an Office of Academic Innovation that is really charged with learning analytics from this point forward. But our question was, where is the library? We weren't engaged in any of this. So we decided that we needed to engage. And there are 4 things that we did, and I'll talk about each of these real briefly. We obtained a Provost Learning Analytics grant to start to look at what would we need to do in order to have reliable data, have usable data, where would we house it, all of those questions. We revised our privacy policy. We partnered with our Chief Privacy Officer, and that may be something else that's unique to our campus is that we do have a Chief Privacy Officer, and we have some very stringent data guidelines, and we also are, I think, as Heather mentioned, partaking in an IMLS grant to explore just this. So this is our current privacy statement. It took us 3 years to get to this point. We changed our privacy back in 2016, April of 16. And during these 3 years, there was lots of campus discussion. What does it mean? And so we took the opportunity that our campus was having these discussions to really change our privacy policy. So we basically say that we may collect some data for the purposes of improving services and integrating with broader university initiatives. It's that simple. We also have an FAQ that Kathleen, who is here, helped me work on. But we also have farther down in the statement that the library data is considered an institutional asset, kind of what Darby was talking about, and may be accessed only by authorized university entities. And I want to acknowledge Saul Berman, he just changed title. He is our Executive Director for Information Assurance now, but he was really instrumental in helping our library go through conversations about privacy, leading our entire campus through a series of discussions and coming up with these principles for data. And this is just a sample. There are actually a few more principles, but I thought these were the most important for this discussion. And I've underlined a few things just to call your attention to. Respect, the responsibility is good for the learner. Transparency, to disclose to students what you're doing. Accountability, to really enforce policies and have policies in place to rely on. And empowerment, that it really, whatever we do with student data should directly benefit the student or answer specific questions around how can we improve learning on our campus. And it was really these guidelines and having them in place that made our library feel more comfortable moving forward with using data, was that we knew that the university as a whole was adhering to these, and so we had a lot of structure behind us. And I don't know if Jack Bernard is in the room, but I wanted to acknowledge Jack Bernard as well. He is in our general counsel's office and really helped us understand our own state laws in Michigan around library privacy and library records. And a lot of what we assumed actually wasn't true, we found out. So he was really instrumental in our library discussions as well. I did want to give one library example of what we've done, and we did this a couple years ago before we had all of our data flows in place. But this is an example of our Hale scholars who are low socioeconomic students who receive full tuition. They quite often come from smaller towns, perhaps they're first gen, so they don't have the experience in dealing with a big university. And many of them end up struggling after their first year if they don't have meaningful connections. So our registrar was very concerned about them and looked to the library and asked, how are these students engaging with the library? Are they even engaging? So we looked at the 2 years' worth of data that we had at that point of identifiable circulation, interlibrary loan, instruction, and actually special collections as well. And what we found was one of the questions we asked in looking at these students was, after they come to the library for an instruction session, do they re-engage with the library after that? Do they choose to? And what we found out was that actually that the Hale students engaged really at twice the rate of our general population of students. So after having instruction, they were almost double more likely to check out books, ask for interlibrary loan, although special collections usage was very low, but that's not surprising because these are first and second year students. They're really not at the third and fourth year level yet. So we were really pleased to be able to actually see that they were engaging with the library and they felt comfortable coming back, and it got us thinking, what else could we do to engage and support these students more? But the registrar, we could answer his question because we had this data. Lastly, our IMLS Library Learning Analytics project that we're working on now. There's a URL up there. You can go look at more. It's libraryanalytics.org. But we are really combining library data, all of our data that we have, electronic resource use, all of that, combining it with university data to see, is there any correlation of things? What data makes sense to keep? What data maybe we don't want to keep in the future. But as part of that, we developed a privacy guide to help start conversations on other campuses. So that's the real point that I wanted to make on this, was if you're thinking about having conversations about privacy, we point to things that we found particularly helpful in having those conversations, both in the library and with campus. So some closing thoughts about our journey was that we can really be integral learning analytics partners. Our universities take great care with student data and often have far more private data than the library does, but we also, as the library, can take great care with it. And there's lots we can do with it, as Darby mentioned, from service improvement. We have checkout history now for patrons that they've been asking for years, and we can demonstrate our impact. That's it.
Great. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to, oh, I sound quite loud. In contrast to Doreen, I'm going to look at privacy as it relates to external parties. So in this case, patron access to vendor resources. I'm going to contrast two different approaches to privacy, IP authentication and single sign-on, and then talk a little bit about the technology and policy issues around single sign-on. So first, IP address authentication, the approach used for the vast majority of patron access. So just briefly, in this table, the columns distinguish issues that are either primarily helpful or harmful to achieving library objectives, and the rows distinguish issues that are either primarily impacting users or the institution. The intent isn't to methodically capture every issue in detail. What I'm trying to do is just paint a broad brush that can help characteristic the pros and cons of different approaches. So IP authentication has very well-known and clear benefits for users. The ability to access in one click, at least on campus. The fact that vendors don't receive any personally identifiable information, or PII in my slides. It's a familiar technology for libraries. But it also has some attributes that cause real issues for both users and institutions. On the user side, the requirement to access via proxy links forces off-campus users to jump through hoops when discovering resources in the open web. And off-campus access brings extra friction when users have to log into a proxy. Anonymity delivers a generic experience by design, which, as Darby was suggesting, it's at odds with the increasingly personalized experiences that we seek in our personal lives. And getting that personalized experience forces users to register their personal information directly with vendors, which is a bit of an irony when the goal is to protect user privacy. And if we look at the institutional side, proxying is inherently unstable. Many seemingly trivial changes to websites cause proxy configurations to break, as I'm sure many of you know, whether it's changes to domains, JavaScript, cookies. And in addition, IP addresses themselves are subject to change, sometimes without the knowledge of your library. They're often stored in a variety of formats. They pass through many hands between IT, library, and vendors. IP addresses also present some pretty serious security challenges because of the difficulty of determining the underlying user, one of the reasons that you rarely see them solely used for authentication outside of our industry. Some campus IT departments deploy web security products like Zscaler that anonymize outgoing IP addresses, perhaps not initially aware of the chaos this causes libraries. So these security challenges directly impact libraries when vendors experience fraudulent access. IP addresses are pretty blunt tools. Shutting them down knocks out good actors and bad actors equally. And finally, access to the sorts of analytics that Doreen's talking about are really limited if all library access is completely anonymous. So switching to single sign-on. So there's some really helpful attributes of single sign-on. Users get access at the point of discovery. No need to search for a proxied link or reroute URLs or web pages. The process is comparable to the other information access experiences we have in our lives. And users can get a personalized experience without sharing personal information, and I'll come back to this shortly. Single sign-on also brings benefits to the institution. Your institution controls what, if any, personal information is shared externally. The technology has a strong trust fabric, which is just a fancy way of saying that you can be really confident of who the counterparty is on the other side, unlike IP addresses. Stopping unauthorized access is as simple as disabling a login. There's no collateral damage to other users. And the ability to deliver more granular reporting, such as usage by cost code or department, can be valuable for some libraries. But there are some aspects of single sign-on which can be harmful. It obviously takes a bit more time to sign in compared to immediate on-campus authentication. Local IT policies can add friction by requiring you to re-enter your credentials multiple times a day rather than just say daily. There's obviously the risk that personal information is mistakenly released by your institution, which does happen. And the concern that the recipients of that personal information abuse it. They use it for purposes other than that for which it was intended. And what about the user? We're not giving them any choice in this process. Don't they, you, deserve a say about how your personal information is used? On the institutional side, the biggest change is probably the loss of library control. It's not that libraries typically control IP addresses on campus, but single sign-on does rely on a campus user directory that's managed by IT, on software that's controlled by IT, and this can feel particularly scary in institutions where there's little mutual understanding between library and IT, which is quite common. So, we've got two contrasting approaches. Under IP address authentication, privacy is prime, but it comes with some heavy costs, such as usability off campus and security. Users get a fundamentally anonymous library experience. Single sign-on can deliver a more personalized, engaging library experience. It still preserves privacy, potentially simpler access at the point of discovery, but control shifts more clearly to IT, and the benefits depend on how the technology is applied in practice, which is where we come to now. So it's really critical that we distinguish between what the technology can do to preserve privacy and the policies and practices that ensure it actually works that way. So institutions are the gatekeepers. There's a process called attribute release that decides what user data or attributes are released during authentication. The technology supports a sliding scale of privacy. So on one end, you can have a completely anonymous experience where every user has a completely unique ID, whether they're coming in or coming back. Somewhere in the middle, you can have some personalization, but without sharing personal information using a pseudonymous ID. Think of it like a Halloween costume you keep wearing. No one tells your identity, but they can recognize you when you come back. And at the other end, you can share personal information if it's relevant and necessary. However, when it comes to policy, there is no settled industry policy. Practice varies widely across both publishers and institutions. I'm almost done. Some institutions pay careful attention to what's shared, some less so. Some publishers have clear policies on what they collect and why, some less so. So I'm just going to put a little plug here for seamlessaccess.org. It's a cross-industry body looking to improve access for research and scholarship through federated identity management. I'm a member of the governance committee, and we've got several important initiatives to address these policy gaps. So we're developing best practices around the use of data and policies for assuring compliance. We've set up a cross-industry working group, including librarians, to define a test set of attribute release profiles to try and simplify the process, reduce errors, and also make it easier for libraries to engage with IT in this topic. And we're setting up a working group to develop reusable contract language that reflects these attribute release policies and provides assurance that they're being adhered to. 2:30 p.m. today, Courtyard Marriott Hotel, dedicated presentation on this, worth coming to. Thank you.
So I want to thank all three panelists for sticking to the agreed time so that we now can have a discussion with you. There's a microphone in the front. If you have questions for any of the speakers, I think we need to turn this one on. Just let's check and make sure it's on. And go ahead, Athena.
Hi, I'm Athena Hepner from the University of Central Florida, and I'm keenly interested in authentication technologies and also in some of the potential learning analytics information that we could be gathering and aren't right now. And so I know that a lot of the sites are able to fingerprint our users, whether it's Google or one of the public publishers or platform vendors. I know that they already have this ability. I'm curious how many of our library platform vendors are using that information in some way. And to turn this into a question, it really kind of boils down to me into transparency and control for the users and also to the libraries. So how many of the vendors are willing to tell libraries what they're already gathering? How many of the authentication systems can build in the ability for end users to see what information is being passed about them and give them some control over whether to add more information about themselves for better personalization or reduce the amount of information that's given for better anonymity, I can't talk right now, privacy, better privacy.
So, is this on? Well, I'm just loud. So it's absolutely true. So browsers collect vast amounts of information about us all. We know this is normal in our lives, regardless of what happens at institutional levels. And
Oh, is it not on?
it's not on.
Oh.
Oh, sorry. Eat the mic. I remember that. Thank you.
He's too British to talk loud.
Yeah. Hello. So yes, it's absolutely true that fingerprinting does occur. It occurs regardless of whether we're in an institution or outside an institution. And I don't have data on this, but I suspect that most publishers are using or increasingly looking to use marketing tools which gather that sort of anonymous but fingerprintable information about the browser you're using, the settings you're using, the sort of pages you're looking at. So unfortunately, I'd love to have more data on that, and actually something I'll take away. What I would like to respond to is this issue of user choice. I mentioned it briefly in my presentation, and where is the user in this? We're making decisions for them. So one of the initiatives that Internet 2 have been doing in partnership with Duke University is something called scalable consent. If you haven't come across it before, Google scalable consent. And it's an initiative that it's providing some software, sort of like a plug-in to Shibboleth, Shibboleth being open source software for federated identity management. And scalable consent provides workflows that so when your users are logging in through single sign-on, they can also have some control over what information is shared. And essentially, you have a framework that says this is what the institution is prepared to share at a basic level, which might be almost nothing. And then there's what else we know that you, the user, might want to share. So it's a really great idea because it means, for example, that you, as an institution, can say, we're just going to share nothing. But if you want to personalize something and get, say, recommendations via email, you, the user, can then give consent and say, what, I'm happy to share this and benefit from more personalization. That is something just seems obvious. We really should be providing our users with those choices.
You said the working group for Coalition for Seamless Access is coming together. Are the members decided, or is it still open?
So that's a good question. So we have a working group up and running now looking at this issue of attribute release configuration. So how IT maybe configures what information is shared. If you want to be a part of that, come and see me afterwards. We are setting up a working group that will be looking at contract terms and template language. That is not set up yet, and absolutely come and see me if you're interested in that.
Okay.
Right, you two want to-
Lisa?
Hi, thanks to all of you. Lisa Hinchliff at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Very concerned about varying levels of privacy. I particularly appreciate the distinction between what the technology enables, which is true for both learning analytics as well as our remote access systems, and then the policies that are in place that say, okay, but here's what we will actually do or not do. But to be a little bit provocative about this, I think what we've learned is that those policies are often lies. And I'm not necessarily saying in our own environment, but we know, for example, that Facebook and Google are paying large fines, or what feel like large fines, but turn out to be rounding error in their budgets, in the European Union. So what I'd like to ask is, in any of these models that we're developing, where is the role of audit? And particularly for the end user, how can they audit that a system is actually only doing what it has said it will allow, what they have said it will allow? And then with the coalition, I appreciate these ideas of templates, but could I even go so far as to ask whether the coalition would be willing to publicly audit and remove vendors from the coalition? You can't stop them from using SAML, but from being able to say that they're a member of the coalition if they do not adhere to certain principles that are in the templated contractual terms. Thank you.
I think it's another Tim question.
So yes and yes-ish. So the definite yes is yes, that people who, again, I'll be talking more about this at 2:30, but there's going to be a central service which will simplify the process of single sign-on authentication. Sorry, eat the mic, yeah. Seamless Access will be operating a centralized service which will help simplify single sign-on. In order to use that service, service providers like publishers will need to sign up to best practices about their use of data. These are very congruent with some of the things that you were saying, Darby, and your Dean, Sol, about data minimization, data prevention, retention. If we find that someone is not meeting those standards and they don't cure the breach, it wasn't a mistake, then they will be cut off from the service. So to the extent that the industry is moving towards single sign-on, this becomes a really important way that people access services. That's a meaningful sanction. What we can't do is audit what happens locally between your institutions and your service providers, because what we're doing centrally, by design, we don't touch any of your data. We don't see what's flowing through. We're sort of a pass-through, and again, I'll explain it in more detail at 2:30. We'll show it to you. So the auditing is more challenging, but by providing contractual template terms, the idea is to create a framework where it's much more transparent for you in dealing with publishers and vendors to say, okay, I want it laid out exactly what you're going to do with what when. And I also wholeheartedly agree on the ability for users to be able to see what data is being shared, and I think that's where scalable consent could go. We're not there yet, but in the next 2, 3, 4 years, I'd be saddened if we didn't start having software we could use which gave the power for users to see exactly what's being shared and why. Mm-hmm. But there are issues there. Some institutions don't want to share stuff with users in that way. There's no consensus on opinion about whether users should be part of the process or not, I found in talking to institutions.
Yeah, I think in our increasingly networked world, it reveals to us that we have always had so much that has been culturally based on the concept of trust. And trust becomes something that can be challenged by new technologies. But there also may be technologies and perhaps potentially where I could see a space for building more of a technology that doesn't require trust is around using blockchain technology to fill in some of these gaps between what's going on locally and what folks are choosing to expose, and that's a system that may not really rely on. It may force people into and organizations into complying with policies rather than simply relying on trust.
Next question.
Hi, good morning. I'm Adam Beauchamp from Florida State University. And I wonder how the panel responds to some of the latest research that's been more critical of these sort of data analytics projects, both in and outside of librarianship. In particular, the Data Doubles project, which has discovered a much more sophisticated student thoughts about privacy and how their expectations change when they move from some of the commercial online environments to places like the library and the college campus. Andrew Asher and Brooke Robertshaw's meta-analysis that showed that the effect size of some of the learning analytics studies is vanishingly small, which should give us pause. And in particular, I think Darby, you referenced that the library culture and resistance to learning analytics is based in a whiteness in library, which is, there is definitely a whiteness in libraries, but there's a lot of research that shows that this sort of surveillance is most damaging, whether on purpose or unintentionally, to people of color. I'm thinking of Sophia Noble, Algorithms of Oppression, Ruha Benjamin's work, and the new Jim Code, and I think of Virginia Eubanks on automating inequality. So I wonder how you respond to the critics.
Yeah, so those are definitely all issues that we've thought about as we've gone down that road. To take a couple things. So the article, well, let's start with the data double. So I think it's great that students are making distinctions between where they give their privacy. And it seems, though, that on campuses, if it is an issue where they're getting some direct benefit, they're more willing to share their data. And that's the whole goal of where we say that we're going to use data, is if the student is going to get a direct benefit or if it's going to help the campus at large move forward on a particular learning issue or a particular thing related to student achievement. So we feel comfortable in that area that students are willing, and so that's why disclosure is so important, and that's one of the principles that we have in our guidelines is disclosure and sharing with students as much as we can, which is why we're giving them a student-facing dashboard so they can see what we're collecting and what we're doing with it. And there are students who are part of the panels that engage with this and decide where to go. So students are very much a part of what we develop going forward and listening to them and what services they would like improved in that. As far as the meta-analysis, we've looked at that meta-analysis, and our assessment specialist actually has some concerns about it and thinks that things could have actually done better in that meta-analysis. So not to discredit what it says, and looking at one information literacy instruction session isn't, I think we all agree, isn't going to make a huge difference. But it's the whole picture of library engagement that we're trying to look at, so not just one instance. So we hope to be able to build upon that and take a better look. And there may be some data points that really are not worth keeping, and that's great to know in the future. We won't bother looking at that aspect of patron data, but maybe there are one or two that seem to be more relative and could help us in the future.
Darby?
We don't have time to do justice to the specific question that you raised there, except I want to say thank you so much for raising that, because this is, my own thoughts about these issues are extremely unsettled right now, but I really appreciate it. I think those are the types of conversations that we need to be having, and so that, that's what we need to talk about. We can't do it.
I
in
smell
4
a session
minutes
for
right
next
now.
year.
But yeah, definitely. Let's talk. Thank you.
Yep. Go ahead.
Good morning, Michael Mess, Florida State University. No, we did not coordinate this. We have another Floridian behind us and wanted to ask the first question. So clearly a topic on Florida's mind anyway. I want to, first of all, thank you also for bringing up the user perspective on this. I think too often this has been a process that we have designed because librarians know best. So I really appreciate hearing your vision on that. What I'm curious is a slightly different question, which is international perspectives on privacy, freedom to read, etc. Obviously, we're looking at this, I see you start us with the ALA code, well, the most recent version anyway, and some previous instances. But I'm just curious, can you share anything on what you know about, other perspectives in the world, how other countries, other societies, other cultures have solved this? Would be one question. And then the second part is a little bit around the GDPR and other rules that are also coming in, which are going to give our users supposedly greater rights to, to control their own data online, to be forgotten if they want to be, etc. So I think those are issues that we're grappling with a little bit as this is going to spill over our way as well. So I'm just curious if you had any perspectives. Thank you.
Tim, you want to kick off?
Eat the mic. So I just wanted to say two things. One is that one of the really exciting participants in Seamless Access is an organization called FIM4L, Federated Identity Management for Libraries. Google that as well if you're interested in this area. And it's a group of European individuals, librarians, who have, want to advocate on making sure that federated identity management is done in a privacy-preserving way. And a lot of where they come from is European influenced and GDPR perspective. So it's a very interesting group, and we're very actively working with them. And the second thing I was going to say was, it was the second part of your question. What was the second part? The perspective. Oh, GDPR, thank you.
How could you forget GDPR? Oh my goodness.
So I was just going to note that, separate from this, we provide identity and access solutions for publishers, and the number of publishers who are actively seeking to provide their users with tools to manage their data has rocketed up, and it's got nothing to do whether they're actually based in Europe or necessarily serving European users. There is just a sea change that's happened. You may not perceive this at your end yet, but I'm further upstream in terms of the technology, and publishers and service providers are actively interested in trying to push this stuff out, not least because of legal compliance and risk.
I'll just say briefly, too, I've over the last couple of years, had a number of interactions and some really interesting conversations, particularly with Chinese librarians and scholars. And of course, China is in a very different place culturally on these issues. But what was really interesting to me is that while the context is very different, the ways that they raise these questions and the concerns that they have in terms of the impact of these things is actually surprisingly similar. So I think there's a lot more space for international conversation here for sure.
We've got about 3 minutes.
Rich Goss, University of Central Florida. Athena, have had discussions about, as we look at moving to single sign-on and the potential that it has, the attributes about students that exist that could be released to the library. We're looking at not the library releasing, but getting that data for the library to analyze usage of our databases and resources in terms of undergraduates versus graduates by discipline, and the interdisciplinary use of databases that their folks are using that they don't realize that are outside their discipline. But how you approach those discussions within the library and with your partners on campus to establish that value of being able to do that analysis.
So that's one thing that we've just, on this Learning Analytics grant, we're in year 2 of year 3, and I probably should have mentioned that. But so this year we've been setting up our data pipelines, really, and working with Kathleen, who's our Electronic Resources Officer, and our IT, and really getting those data flows from what we can tell from our databases. And we probably have reliable data maybe on 30 to 40% of the electronic access use, which we'd like to increase from there. But I guess to this point, it hasn't been, we're really trying to engage our subject specialists in thinking about what difference would it make in the work that they do and the outreach that they do to departments and faculty and graduate students to help them understand what does the whole picture look like about the resources they're using. And we're very interdisciplinary in how our university works, so I think that will be reflected in our use. But I think they're great conversations to think about having forward once we actually can do more with the data and actually can see what the data is telling us about them. So we're not quite there yet, but we hope to be soon.
In like the last 30 seconds, because I've got the microphone, I just wanted to mention, you touched on it briefly during faculty. So we think a lot about the identifiable information around students, but there's data around faculty behavior that's also collected, which might be a little bit more sensitive if faculty actually have the bandwidth to realize it. Could you just address that?
Yeah, one of the questions a researcher we're working with is interested in, from the faculty viewpoint, is not only learning but funding issues. So he is interested in looking at, for faculty who apply for grants and do not get the grant, do they have any engagement with the library before they resubmit, and are they funded at that point? So he's putting timeline into faculty engagement with grants and funding and library usage to see if there are any patterns that he can tell from that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's thank our panelists today, and thank you for coming.